Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at how to get started using MRDCL. This video really is aimed at beginners who have never used MRDCL before. If you've already used MRDCL, you really can be moving on to other videos. So in this video you'll find the files in the int02 folder. We're going to be looking at a script called getstarted1.stp, and it's going to be working with a data file called data1.asc. So let's open up this script and let's work through this. Now the first thing you'll notice is there's a lot of text in this script here, in this STP file, and scripts can use exclamation marks as comments in them so that they just get ignored by MRDCL. The way an exclamation mark works is it ignores everything to the right of it on that particular line. So if we put an exclamation mark down the left hand side here, it's actually going to ignore the whole of that line. Now you might find that useful as a refresher when you come to use these files, but all these comments here are just explaining what I'm about to explain to you now. So let's look at this MRDCL script. It's a really basic script and take you through exactly what's going on. Well, I'm going to start also by showing you the data that I'm going to be working with here. And if we open up the data file, you'll see in this data file we've got 3 lines which represents 3 records or 3 respondents, and some data here that goes from left to right. In the first 4 fields we've got a record number. In the 5th field we've got a 1 here, a 6th a 1, a 7th a 0, and so on. We're just going to be picking up the first couple of fields in this data. Alright, let's close that and go back to our script and let's look at what we've got. Now the way MRDCL works is it has stages in it. So every MRDCL script should be in a file with an STP file extension, and every MRDCL file that's an STP file effectively should have a control stage in there. All of the other stages that are allowed are optional, but you must have a control stage. So this particular control stage tells us that it begins with a start control, ends with a finish control. It just tells us one piece of information. It tells us that the data file is in a file called data1.asc. And you'll note the comma on the ends of the lines. Those commas, I'm afraid, are mandatory. You have to have them there, otherwise MRDCL will get confused and think you've got an error. So this tells it in the control stage just one piece of information, that the data is going to be residing in that file we looked at just now called data1.asc. Now there are many more commands that can go in that control stage, but we'll get to those in subsequent videos. So let's look at the next stage now. We're beginning now a data stage, and that indeed is the bulk of our project. You already have worked out, I'm sure, that each stage begins with a start command and a finish command. So we'll see further down our script here a finish data command. There it is, and that completes the data stage. And finally at the bottom we'll see there's a start tables for a table stage and a finish tables to end that table stage. Now there are other stages that you can have as well, but we're just going to be sticking to control, data and tables in this video. So what goes in the data stage first of all? Well, the data stage has a couple of lines of control at the top that tell it about the particular survey data, and this is telling us that the serial number is in 1 to 3. I actually think it should be 1 to 4, so let's correct that while we're here. And it's telling us the card characters. Now that data file we looked at was an ASCII data file, and I think it ran to something like 30 or 40 characters or fields. Here it's been set to 1000, so it is wasting a little bit of time, but actually that doesn't really take much time up. If we put 99999, the maximum 99,999, that might start to take up or eat up a little bit more time if we had a large number of records. But really it doesn't matter. So it's been set here, as long as it's in excess of what the real length is, it'll be fine. So it's been set to 1000 when it didn't need to be as big as that. Alright, the rest of the data stage is going to be used for specifying the variables that we're going to be picking up so that we can perform tests on them for checking data or to do tables. Now, as we saw just now, or mentioned just now, all of this text here is just text which are comments. So I'm going to leave you to read those if you want to when you open the files or use the files from the data provided. Now we get to our first lines of script, and in here you can see we're defining our first variable. So what does this line actually mean? Well, before we worry about what each line means, let's understand how MRDCL works. MRDCL is free format, and what that means is it doesn't really matter how I lay it out, except for those very top lines in the control stage. So I have laid this out in a line where I'm actually defining this in one line, a piece of text on the next line, another piece of text, and so on. That's just purely there to make it easy to read. If I wanted to, I could put that on a new line. I could space that across there if I wanted to. I could put that on a new line. It really wouldn't matter. MRDCL would still read it correctly because it's a free format piece of software. So I'm just putting it back to how it was, and now let's look at what it looks like. And I should say, when I talk about free format, the only time that spaces are significant are when you're entering or using text. So clearly, if I typed in the word yes here without the spaces, but I put some spaces in there, MRDCL would put in those spaces because it wouldn't know any better and would have to treat those spaces as meaning you wanted two words with 5 or 6 gaps in between. Alright, so we'll set it back to yes, but otherwise it's all free format and you can lay it out if you want to. Some people like to indent their files. They like to do this so that they're indented so that they're a bit easier to read, but I'm not going to do that in this video. Alright, let's look at this in detail and understand just what's going on here. So I want to pick up the data that was in that 5th field. Now if we go back to that data, let's have a look at it again. Here it is. I want to pick up this question here that's stored in this field here. So it's that 1 there, that 2 there, and that 1 there for the third respondent, where 1 is going to mean yes and 2 is going to mean no. Alright, let's go back to our script and see how this works. Well, you can see I'm picking up the codes 1 to 2 there. 1-2 means pick up all of the codes in the range 1 to 2. In other words, 1 and 2. I could have just typed 1, 2. That would have meant the same thing. But 1-3 would have meant 1, 2, 3. So it does matter if you have more than 2 codes. So it's going to pick up codes 1 and 2. And let's look to the left now and understand what it's doing. So the first thing we see is DS. Now D stands for define. S tells it what type of variable you're defining. And there's 5 types of variables in MRDCL. They are single, multi, integer, real number, and character. So let's quickly explain what those are, although the others are covered, or some of those are covered in other videos. S means that it's single, that only one answer maximum can be given to that particular variable. So when we've got a question that's yes, no, not stated, as we have here, somebody can't say yes and no. That wouldn't make sense. However, if there were a question where you were asking which brands have you ever bought, that would be a multiple response question, and so they would be allowed to choose any number of answers, and they would choose M there for multi. And we've got similar question types or variable types for integers where you'd put I, for a real number where you slightly confusedly put the letter W, and character variables where you're picking up perhaps strings of text which you have with the letter C. We'll encounter those in subsequent videos. So now we're defining a single variable. That space there is totally optional. You can have it there or you can just remove it if you want to. It doesn't matter. And this tells it what you're going to call the variable. Now the dollar is significant. That tells it that what follows is a variable name. So we do need that dollar there. And the variable name that I'm assigning to this particular question on my questionnaire is Q1. Now the variable name is important, or can be important, and it's worth knowing a bit about that. So Q1 is just a sensible name for my variable. I tend to call all my questions Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4A, or whatever it might be. You haven't got to follow that. You can give them names if you want to. Names of variables should generally be up to 30 characters in length and start with a letter. So they have to be within 30 characters. They can use letters, numbers, and the underscore character. So Q1_1 would be a perfectly valid name. And they should always start with a letter. Now, there's one exception to which letter you might use in most circumstances. The letter X has a special meaning in MRDCL, which means that it's temporary and you don't want to use it in tabulations. Now, that will be covered a little bit more in a future video, but generally your variable should begin with a letter, could be followed by letters and numbers, or the underscore character. Now, it's not a rigorous rule that you can use any name you want to. So we could actually call our variable &7* if we wanted to. If we did, we'd have to enclose it in single quotes, and every time we referred to it, it would have to appear in single quotes. Now that just makes it uncomfortable to work with, or less easy to work with. Indeed, we could call it 1 if we wanted to. That would be a perfect valid name if it's in single quotes. Personally, I tend to avoid calling any variables with single quotes and just start with a letter, using Q for a question, and sometimes V if I'm combining things together to make a variable from different questions. So that's our variable name, Q1, and we can refer to that in future. Then we get to the other side of the equal sign, and here you can see I've got another dollar, and that's going to tell us something about what we're setting that to. Well, in this particular case, I'm setting it to what's in the fifth field, that 1 and 2 you may recall in the data file. So that's referring to the fifth field. There's a / now to delimit it from the codes we're picking up, and I'm picking up code 1, comma, then the second code, then a comma, and finally I'm picking up E, and E has a special meaning to it. E means that it's what we call an error bit. We call these codes in here bits, so that third one on the end there is an error bit, and what that means is that anybody who hasn't given an answer to this question will drop into that particular bit or response. Now that's quite useful, because when you produce tables, you quite often, if you've got a yes/no type question, there might be 2% of people who haven't answered, and that can make the tables a little bit confusing. People wonder why a table adds up to 98%, for example. So with an error bit on the end, with an E, we can put anybody who didn't say yes and no, who didn't answer the question at all, into that not stated category, and 2% will appear, and someone can logically see then that the data adds to 100%. Now we come to the text that we're going to use, and you'll see that it begins here X equals quote. So X equals quote means that whether I tabulate this question vertically or horizontally in a table, so whether it appears down the side of a table or across the top of a table, I want the same text to apply when I tabulate question 1. So X means refer to the same thing vertically and horizontally. Equals, the quote tells it that we're now going to be entering text, and once we're in quotes or single quotes, it means that spaces are significant, except when they're leading spaces or trailing spaces. So putting in 2 spaces here and 2 spaces here will just simply get truncated or removed by MRDCL, but if I put a space in here, that would be honoured in the output that we generated. So my first response is yes, and you can see the delimiter to separate that from the next response is no. I can put that on the same line if I want to, so I can just go like that, and I'll put no on the same line. That would work fine. Semicolon here delimits the second text, which is no, and finally the third text is NS, standing for not stated, and that has no semicolon after it. It just closes with a quote, and like all MRDCL commands, it ends with a comma. Yes, you will find those commas annoying at first, and you'll miss them off, and you'll get errors as a result of that, but it does soon become quite familiar. Now we've got a line that's commented, and we'll look at that in a subsequent video. XT means this is the title that I want, whether I tabulate it vertically or horizontally. And here I go into text again with a quote, and this is the text that will get put at the top of my table, which says, Q1, have you used MRDCL before? That's the text it's going to use, and it closes that out with a quote and a comma, just like it did for the labels or responses. Let's move on. There's the description of what I've just told you here if you want to reread that anytime. Now let's move to a multi-question, and here you can see for question 2, if we refresh the screen with the data, you may recall that that multi-response question had 3 answers stored in these 3 fields, and one of the ways that multi-response questions can be stored is that 1 means the answer's true, 0 or blank means it's not true. So for the first respondent, 100 means that the first answer was what they selected and the second and third weren't selected, whereas we come down to this bottom one here where we've got 111, this respondent selected all 3 responses. So this is picking up that data. This time we've got an M for multi, $, the variable's called Q2 just as before, and this time it's picking up the 6th field, answer 1, the 7th field, answer 1, and the 8th field, answer 1. Now there is a shorthand way of saying that. That does exactly the same thing. So saying $6 minus 8 when you've got a multiple response question will tell MRDCL you're just picking up 1 code, which is a common way to store multiple response questions, as 617181, just like the line before, but in a shorthand form. Then we go to the text, same as before here, X equals quote, and here's our 3 responses: ate at a restaurant, semicolon to delimit it, and so on. Same with the title, nothing new here. So that was quite easy really. Once we'd learnt single, there weren't too many different rules, and indeed single and multivariables generally act quite similarly, with of course 1 or 2 changes or exceptions to deal with that, which we'll cover in the other getting started videos. So that's finishing the data stage. I can now move to my table stage and I can tabulate this data. So a table stage begins with start tables, it ends with finish tables, and you can see I've got 2 simple tables here. The first one is called table number 1 is Q1, so Q1 goes down the left hand side and Q2 goes across the top, whereas table 2 is question 2 down the left hand side, and that's got nothing across the top, so it just ends star comma, so that'll be a total column only with nothing cross-analysed across the top. It's important in a table stage that every table number is unique, so this has to be called a different table number from this one, otherwise MRDCL will try to either add the figures together, or if they're not the same size table, will reject them as an error. So that's produced tables 1 and 2, and you'll see down here there's a bit more description explaining just what I've told you here. So let's close this out, let's close our data, and let's run this, and we do that either by clicking on the Go button, or we can check File and Run. It does the same thing, and we want to run the steps compile, execute, print. Compile means it's going to read my instructions and check that they're logically correct with no errors. Execute means it's going to read my data and build the tables. And print doesn't mean it's going to send it to the printer, it's going to make a file that we can print. So let's click OK to that, and you can see we've got 2 pages of output from our survey. We can open the tables file by editing the text file, and sure enough, here's our 2 tables. Table 1 was question 1 analysed by question 2, down the so Q1 down the side, Q2 across the top, and the second table was just question 2 in total down the left hand side with nothing across the top. So we produced our first tables in MRDCL. In the next video you'll find that we move to the next level of complexity, looking at some more basic things that you might want to do using MRDCL. Thank you.